Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're so glad you could join us. We're going to be discussing managing changes to currently marketed medical devices. So we're very excited you're here. I'm Gay Esser, the marketing manager here at RegDesk. And if you don't know what RegDesk does, we're an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. And our platform allows RA teams to leverage AI so you can prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. We do truly appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us, and we're very thankful that you're here. Just to give a little bit of a preview of what's coming, Jodi and Danielle are going to share information with you, and at the end, we'll save the last 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions. So we'll be able to go through those that you throw in the chat, and we'll talk about those at the end. And at the end, too, after this, we'll share the slide deck and recording, so be on the lookout for that in the next few days. Now let me take a moment to introduce our esteemed experts. We have Jodi, Granger, and Danielle Metzger. Jodi brings over 37 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has held leadership roles overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices. And we're also privileged to have her as our Director of Regulatory Affairs at RegDesk. So thank you for joining us, Jodi. And then I'll share a little bit about Danielle. Danielle works for Network Partners Group and is a quality leader with over 25 years experience across medical devices, pharmaceuticals, biotech, and SaaS-enabled life sciences. Her expertise spans the full product life cycle, quality assurance, compliance, and GMP, GCP operations. Skilled in CAPA audits and regulatory frameworks, she is experienced in partnering with SaaS solution providers to drive compliance, data integrity, and sustainable quality improvements. We're so excited to have both of you here. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Gay. Appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Gay.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. Our agenda, just a quick snippet of what we're going to kind of go over. We'll go through what our learning objectives are for this session. We're going to go through our global landscape and decision logic. We're going to look at some regulation comparisons. What does significant mean? What our regulators think it means. We're going to talk about some decision tree core logic and process flows. We're going to look at enforcement examples and lessons learned, and then have some time for Q&A. So our learning objectives today is we want to kind of look at what change means and what triggers it and what that process kind of looks like. We're going to look at some applying risk-based decision logic to what these changes are in our industry, and kind of take a look at what enforcement risks and what happens if we don't apply those regulations accordingly. So today we're going to kick it off with why change management really matters. In our industry, it's vitally important to follow a change management process. Really, change is inevitable throughout the life cycle of a medical device, whether we are design tweaking, whether we're changing the design completely, whether we have a new supplier, if we have software updates or any kind of manufacturing adjustments. It's critical that we look at all changes to our product, because we have to understand what type of impact these changes are going to have. Even the smallest change can have unintended consequences on the safety, the performance, or compliance of a product, right? Regulators around the world expect companies to assess change systematically and document that rationale for whether or not a regulatory submission is needed. If changes are misclassified or not communicated, that can lead to findings during inspections. It could lead to product recalls or even loss of market access. By applying a structured risk-based approach to change management, organizations can stay compliant, you maintain patient safety, and you keep your devices on the market without any unnecessary delays. Right? So we know that change management is very critical. The next logical question really is to look at, well, how do the regulators actually define what counts as significant or a substantial change? On the next slide or few slides, we're going to compare high-level approaches across the US and EU, And we're also going to take a look at Australia, Canada, and Brazil to see where they align and where they differ. So on the screen here, we have some high-level regulation comparison in what these regulations say, or how they interpret what significant change means. So although each regulator uses slightly different terminology, the underlying principle really is consistent. If a change could affect a device's safety, performance, or its intended use, it's considered significant and likely triggers some form of a regulatory action. So in the US, FDA looks for whether a change could significantly affect safety or effectiveness, while the EU MDR uses the term significant change and relies on notified body review. Australia's TGA focuses on substantial changes to conformity assessment evidence, and Health Canada requires license amendments for Class 3 and Class 4 devices when changes can impact safety or effectiveness. And then Brazil's Anvisa, they distinguish between minor and substantial modifications, with some requiring prior approval. So while the mechanisms and the mechanics may differ, really the core test is the same here. And understanding those nuances kind of helps avoid under or over reporting changes across regions. So in our next slide, we're going to kind of begin to look at the two regions that often set the benchmark for global expectations, which is the US and the European Union. The FDA frames changes in terms of whether they significantly affect safety or effectiveness, while the EU MDR, the focus is whether a change is considered significant in design or intended purpose. So looking at these side by side will really kind of help highlight both the common ground, and we can see some of the subtle differences in how regulators interpret risk. So let's take a look at what significant means, right? So in both the US and the EU, the core question regulators really ask is whether a change could impact the device's safety, performance, or the intended purpose. So the FDA's guidance specifies that a new 510(k) is needed if a change could significantly affect safety or effectiveness, or if it alters intended use. This includes changes like new indications, shifts in technology, material modifications, or major software updates. So in the EU, under the MDR, the concept is framed as a significant change, with MDCG guidance providing flowcharts to help determine when notified body involvement is required. So typical triggers are changes to intended purpose, the design elements that affect clinical performance, or introduction of new patient contacting materials. Those are just some examples. So as we can see, while the language differs, we have significant effect in the US versus significant change in Europe. Really, the practical test, again, is very, very similar. If the modification could alter how a device works for patients, then it's likely to demand a regulatory reassessment. So now let's kind of take a look at what Australia, Canada, and Brazil talk about for significant. So outside of the US and EU, we kind of see similar principles here applied, but they have a little bit of local nuances. So in Australia, the TGA, they require notification when there are substantial changes to conformity assessment evidence or to the ARTG, which is the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. If there's evidence, they have to make changes to their entries. Meaning sponsors need to keep regulators informed if the basis for certification changes. So in Canada, they take a risk-based approach. They require license amendments for Class 3 and Class 4 devices when a change could affect safety or effectiveness, or their guidance provides examples to help companies, and their guidance provides examples to help companies decide what kind of amendments they need to make. And then in Brazil, through Anvisa, they distinguish between minor and substantial changes with certain modification needing prior approval under Anvisa's core regulation, which is RDC 751, and subsequent amendments. So while terminology varies, the expectation really is the same. We need to document change, we need to assess its impact, and escalate to regulators whenever it could alter device safety, performance, or intended use. So as we talk about change, it's really important that companies follow change management processes to ensure that what they're changing is not going to affect its intended use or could harm a patient. And these are really important processes that need to be followed to maintain compliance and not to lose any type of market integrity that we have. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jodi, who's going to talk to us about decision tree for these device changes and the core logic.
Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate it. I think you jumped ahead one slide, so we need to
my apologies.
go
There we
back
go.
one. No problem. So as Danielle said, it's really critical to have a process in place for change control management, especially if you market your products globally. For every country that you sell your products in, the documented assessment needs to be made and documented. And a lot of companies do really well in major markets. They've got their US, their EU assessment process really well defined. Sometimes where I see that they're lagging more behind is really making sure that every other country is assessed as well. So with any country, the process is going to pretty well hold true. First of all, you need to define the change. Whomever is completing the assessment, whether that be someone in your regulatory team at the corporate level, or if you are communicating the change to perhaps a distributor who holds license in various markets, or to a regional partner within your company, it's important to define the change. Every change control needs to bullet out all changes that are being made. Most of you have the experience in dealing with change control that it's very rare that one change is involved in a particular change control. Many times it's multiple things. I'll give an example. You're going to for EU MDR for your product as a result of the new requirements. Your indication for use may need to be narrowed because you only have clinical data to support a narrower use. With that, you are going to be updating your instructions for use. You may be adding changes to your labels for symbology. You may be adding in an SSCP section to your IFU. So it's really very critical that every single change that you are making is documented within that change control process. And also each of those changes are assessed at the country level. So defining the change is critical in this as a first step. That will help you characterize the nature and the scope of change and move on to number 2, which is determining whether there is an impact on safety or performance. Certainly an intended use change, changes to adverse events that may occur, changes to contraindications, all of those are pretty unanimously kind of triggers for a significant change. Each of the modifications that you're proposing needs to go down a decision tree flowchart if they are available by the regulator. Certainly in major markets, they are. FDA provides a decision tree for modifications, as well as the EU through MCDG guidances. But it's important to walk down that decision tree for each of your proposed modifications for each country that you sell. There are explicit triggers that you may need to identify that may put your change into a more significant category. Some of those include changes to critical components. If you're modifying your sterilization method, going from ETO sterilization to something else. Also, software algorithms can be significant as well, because if your software algorithm is modified and the validations are not done properly and demonstrated to show safety and effectiveness, there might be a risk to the patient. So it's really important to understand what those triggers are. The regulatory flowcharts that are provided are certainly helpful in doing that, helping you walk through that process. There are some cases where a modification may result in a different classification. If you are changing your intended use, as an example, maybe your product was used in the peripheral anatomy, and now you're going to, it's the same exact product, but you're going to add a neurovascular indication that may change your classification. So it's important to walk through that classification process as well and ensure that the modification that you're proposing does not reclassify your device. If it does, then certainly new submissions would be required. In terms of the assessments that are being done for each country, you need to determine whether or not a submission is required, or if you can just document the change with your justification, with your change control process internally. Some companies still write letters to file. Others have forms that they use in their change control process that can clearly document their decisions. And so writing formal letters is not required. But as I mentioned, it's important to do this assessment and documentation globally. If you've only covered, your major markets like US, EU, Canada, perhaps, but you also sell to Mexico or Brazil, then the auditors are going to have an issue with you not having made the proper assessments. It's also important to understand if a submission is required, what is the timing associated with making that change? One of the biggest challenges for manufacturers is that every regulatory agency has a different timeline for submissions, especially if it's a significant submission versus a notification. And all of that timing doesn't line up nice and neat for us to be able to implement the change. So manufacturers need to do one of two things. They need to hold off on the change until all markets have the regulatory clearance before they start manufacturing product and selling it with that change. Alternatively, you can develop a process within your organization where you can continue to manufacture the currently approved way, so that you can continue to feed, especially your rest of world markets, while you're going through the approval process, but you're able to implement the change as those approvals come in. So maybe you have your US approval in place, you have high demand, high volume of sales for the US. You want to make that change quickly to cut over a change so that you can start supplying the modified product sooner. You have to have a way to manage that within your organization. There's also some things to consider in terms of post-change validation. Sometimes you go into a plan where you believe that the change will not have an impact on performance. That is the whole intent. You're not trying to make a change on performance, but once you've done the validation testing, you realize, we didn't quite meet the threshold in this area, and this validation or verification testing actually tends to lean toward us maybe having made a significant change, and your regulatory strategy could be modified at that point. It's important to have all your documentation in place to justify not filing before you start selling the modified device. Next slide, Danielle. So again, Danielle spoke to the different jurisdictions. You can certainly look up the regulations governing each market. But at least for some of these high level, European Union is offering very detailed MDCG guidance documents. In addition, if there's any questions in terms of a change that you are wanting to move forward with, if you have any doubts as to whether it should be filed with your notified body, you can always ask them for a consult. Explain to them what you're looking to modify, what data you have that supports it is not a significant change, and you can get that buy-in upfront in Europe if needed. In the United States, as I mentioned earlier, there is a decision tree flowchart of when to submit a 510(k) for a modified device. This clearly walks you through the different types of changes, whether that be labeling, technology, etc., that is available for you to make your decisions. China likewise has guidance on substantive changes that are requiring registration amendments. It will all tie back, as Danielle mentioned earlier, to impacting safety and effectiveness. And then every other emerging market some have guidances. Some of them will rely on other major market guidance in terms of modifications. But many countries, especially some of the smaller countries, do not have that robust of a regulatory process in place where they've provided flowcharts for decision trees, et cetera. So you are still obligated, even in the absence of those decision trees, to ensure that you have made the assessment on safety and effectiveness and determine whether you need to file in those markets before implementing the change. Next slide. So in terms of process for change controls, I find that really, regardless of what company you're working for, regardless of how you define your process, 4 phases really come into play here. The first is kind of initiating the workflow. So you're going to create a change control with whatever process you have documented. And this is where you're going to start writing down exactly what the change is going to be. And as I mentioned before, there's likely multiple changes within one change control. So that's phase 1. The second phase is actually completing the RA assessment. Many companies do phase 1 at kind of a corporate level or at the manufacturing site level. But when it comes to doing the regulatory assessment, that assessment is then branched out into each country. And you may have a distributor who owns the license doing that assessment or a regional regulatory team. So that's phase 2. That's where you'll decide, do we need to file a submission? If so, what documentation is going to be required? What is the timing associated with that assessment? Phase 3 is where you're actually executing the required regulatory action. This is where all the variability comes into play. Each country will have its own timeline. Each country will have its own list of requirements. There may be questions back and forth with the regulatory agency. So being able to coordinate this phase 3 within your organization so that you don't cut over the modified product and start selling it before approval is really critical. And as I mentioned before, this is really where a lot of manufacturers have difficulty kind of lining all of that up. Ultimately, the 4th phase is to close the change control. Until all regulatory actions are done globally, that change control as a whole cannot be closed. You can close out phases of it, meaning, if you've gotten approval in the US and the EU and you want to go ahead and implement it for those countries alone, as long as you have controls in place, you can close things in a phased way. But ultimately, the change control in its totality will not be closed until all markets are cleared. Next phase, slide. So it's hard to read on the video, but we'll send out a copy of this flow chart. It really just maps through those 4 phases, as I mentioned. The first phase being where you're documenting what the change is and being very detailed. The second phase is where you're going into each of the individual countries, making the assessment and determining the timelines. Phase 3 is where each of those individual countries are executing the regulatory action. And ultimately, phase 4 is where you close the change control. And the next slide, I think, is back to you, Danielle, if I remember correctly.
That is correct. It's just technical difficulties again, getting my slide to move. Come back, come on. It's not wanting to. There we go. We'll go that way. Okay. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay. So, these are one of those topics that's important to discuss. It's important that we understand change management, why it's important, what its function is, the decision logic that we take for the markets that we're selling our products in. But we want to kind of take a look and see what happens if we don't follow those processes accordingly. What could happen if we don't do our assessments appropriately, or if we misassess something? What could happen to our product, to our organization? So we're going to take a look at some recent enforcement examples that we've seen in the industry. In recent months, there's been several enforcement actions that have drawn attention to reoccurring themes that we see with companies getting things wrong, particularly around software updates, labeling, compatibility claims, and change control. So one example I have is that one recent FDA warning letter for Metzger Labs was cited for marketing a device without the required pre-market authorization. Another high impact case was for an insulin pump mobile app. There was a recall because the software update for that app resulted in battery drain issues and device failures. So with those issues in mind, they were not properly assessed and causing issues. As we see, we have warning letters and we can have recalls. We also see a broader set, when we examine the broader set of warning letters, we see there's failures of CAPA systems, there's insufficient validations of design or manufacturing changes. There are weak risk assessments, and these are all commonly seen across the industry. They're not isolated slips. They really reflect systematic weaknesses in how change is assessed, how it's documented, and how it's managed. So it's really important that you have the right people in place and the right teams in place to do these assessments properly, and to ensure that we are working with our regulators as needed to ensure our products are safe and effective for our clients and patients. So with that, we can kind of look at what are some of these root causes of why these enforcement failures tend to happen. When we dig into what enforcement actions cite as root causes, there's a few patterns that repeatedly show up. And first and foremost are those risk assessments. Risk assessments are often done, but not deeply enough, that they may ignore cumulative effects, edge cases, or emerging failure modes. Secondly, companies make changes. That could be a software patch, a component or a supplier swap, compatibility enhancements, without fully validating them, or without collecting the evidence that the regulators expect. Thirdly, there is often a mismatch between what the device is being claimed to do in labeling, marketing, or the user interface, and what evidence supports, especially when making compatibility or functional claims. So they can be lacking in the evidence versus what they're saying that they have. Labeling changes are another frequent pain point that we see with organizations. There's alterations and warnings, instructions, or user info that they haven't really been formally evaluated. They haven't been documented properly under change control. And also, we also see in many warning letter cases that documentation just simply isn't sufficient. It's lacking rationale, it's lacking the test reports or traceability, and it makes it difficult to defend the decision path with during the inspection. So across the board, in our industry, we see a time and time again these root causes that are not being, I don't want to say taken seriously, but they're not being held to the limit of scrutiny that they should within our organizations. And this can cause many different issues for organizations, along with market recalls, not getting approved, and not letting the regulators know of our changes that need to be made. So we want, as we go through this, we want to take a look at kind of like, what are we learning as this happens? It's important to see what's happening in our industry. We can take a look at warning letters. We can take a look at the news. But what are we learning from this? Organizations need to have a way to understand what's happening out in the industry and what can they learn to take back to their organizations, to make these a better process, a more streamlined process, a functional process. There are practical takeaways that companies can act on immediately. When considering change, especially software updates or compatibility shifts, we want to treat it with the same level of rigor as any entirely new feature. We want to test it. We want to simulate misuse. We want to capture edge cases. We also want to ensure that the marketing, the labeling, or instructions that align with the device can legitimately do what it's claiming to do. Overclaiming is a big regulatory risk, right? So we want to just state exactly what our products can do. Documentation is our shield, right? Clear records of why you made the change, what was tested, how we assessed the risk, how we decided whether or not a regulatory filing was needed. Documentation will tell our story as to why we made the decisions we made and why we are putting out product that we have. So as I always say, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? So we have to ensure we have clear records of everything we need to do to tell the full story of our product. And again, we don't want to underestimate small changes. What looks trivial inside one department can be significant in another area. Right? So those impact assessments between our departments are vital. And then strengthening our CAPA and QMS around change control will help avoid many of these common pitfalls that we see or are exposed in warning letters. And with that, we want to thank you for listening in today. And now we're going to leave some time for some questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. That was such valuable information, and you both have such a great way of simplifying a very complex process. I feel like I can even do it, and I'm not a regulatory person. So thank you both. We do have some questions. I'm going to start going through them, and we'll see if we can get to answer all of them. And if not, we'll put any that we don't get to in our final summary when we send out the slide deck and the presentation. So for the first question we have, why is managing changes to marketed medical devices so complex on a global scale?
I can jump in on that one, Gay. Thank you. We spoke about it a little bit during the webinar itself. The complexity really comes into play is that not all regulatory agencies handle or define what is or is not a significant change in the same way. In addition, if you do have to take action and do a regulatory filing, the timelines for approvals of that change are not going to line up. So it gets very challenging when you are a company that markets products globally to ensure that you're able to cut over these changes in such a way where you're not interrupting the commercial flow of materials to your customers. Sometimes that requires you to plan ahead, do your regulatory assessments and understand what the map is going to look like. And perhaps you need to pre-build product made the way it is currently approved. build a stock up so that you can control that material and continue to sell it until all of the markets are able to cut over. Other companies have been able to implement systems where they can create different kind of flavors, different versions of a device in a very controlled manner, such that they can cut customers over as those countries get approval. So the first key step into decreasing the complexity, of course, is to make sure you have those assessments done as early as possible and you understand what the global landscape is going to be for that particular change control.
Okay, perfect. And you guys covered this, but the question came in anyway, so I think you could probably just give us a synopsis of what you'd covered. How do I know if a change requires a new submission?
Yeah, that's where your regulatory team is going to come into play here because they understand where to find that information by market. The decision trees that regulators provide are certainly the best framework if they're available. So whether you're utilizing the 510(k) guidance for changing a product under a 510(k) that's been issued by FDA, or you're looking at your EU MDCG guidances. China has flow charts, other markets have flow charts as well. Those are the countries where it's a little easier to make those assessments. In markets where those flow charts and decision trees are not available, it's important to still document that you went through the process and you can write why you feel that it was not significant to notify. Your regional partners will play a bigger role in that, where if they own the license as a distributor or you have a regional regulatory team, they will be able to document within the change control for each of those markets why the decisions were made to not file.
Okay, perfect. Do you have anything else to add, Danielle, or do you think that pretty much covered all of that?
No, that's a great explanation for that. And as Jodi said, really the regulatory department is really your go-to for all those questions.
All right, another question is, do all changes require prior approval?
I'll take that one on. Actually, no, they don't. Some jurisdictions do allow for what's called non-reportable changes, where we do a letter to file in the FDA, or there's amendments that we do in other regions. But what's important to know, though, is, however, even though we can classify something as a non-reportable change, it still must be documented under the QMS and available for audit. So we can tell that story of why it was decided to go through a non-reportable change versus getting prior approval.
Okay, and I know we talked about decision trees, so a question came in about that. Which countries provide formal decision trees for change assessments?
Yeah, certainly FDA, EU markets have decision trees available. China, there are also other guidances, not necessarily flow charts, but other guidances in major markets like Brazil, Canada, Saudi Arabia, and Australia. So it's important that your organization understands how to get the regulatory intelligence that is needed for each of the markets, whether you've got your regional teams seeking that regulatory intelligence yourselves, or you partner with a service provider to provide that regulatory intelligence for you.
Okay, and we have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to keep going with a couple more questions that we have, and we'll see if we can get through all of these, and then we won't have to send them out. So another question is, how do timelines differ between regions?
Yeah, that's a good one. They differ depending on the regions, right? So the FDA, supplements with the FDA can take anywhere from 90 to 100 days. The EU, the notified body assessments, they kind of vary by capacity. It's often around 6 to 12 months. And then in other regions, it could take anywhere from 16 to 18. It really depends on, what is happening in those regions. And then in new emerging markets, they may require full registration renewal with any type of significant change. So it really depends on that specific market.
Okay,
And
and
I'll
then
just add, I just want to add on to that a little bit. That is why the assessment up front and the planning is so critical. You need to understand the typical window for approval of the changes so that your company can plan accordingly. We know that some modifications that are being made to product are critical in that you don't have time to wait to make the change. As an example, if you've got a supplier who's providing you a pouch for your product and they are no longer going to be able to provide that to you, they've got a defined cutoff period. That is your sterile barrier on your product. You have to be able to cut over when you run out of supply. So making sure that you understand the landscape in each country and at least a ballpark for the approval timeframes will help set your change control and your company up for success.
Perfect. Thanks for adding that. It looks like that kind of leads us into another question that's talking about the global markets. So what's the best way to synchronize changes across markets?
I think getting that plan documented in place and then making sure that you're coordinating early on what documentation is going to need to be provided for each of those markets. You know, do you need to have your validation data completed? Do you need to have your instructions for use translated with the modifications that you're proposing? All of those deliverables will be critical to coordinating the plan. And then, depending on how varied your approval timelines are for your market, the company needs to decide how are we going to manage to keep having product for our customers. Do we need to pre-build, and if so, how much? How are we going to manage that product that's built, with this version versus the new version is going to be controlled within our organization, and we don't accidentally ship something made the wrong way to a given market. So those are the key things. I think one area I find that companies struggle is that they only bring the regulatory and the quality team in too late. And they do not have that assessment piece done early enough for them to take action and develop, a proper project plan to ensure that your clients can still get their product. So I encourage you, all functions, to ensure that your quality and your regulatory team are brought in early on so that they can help get that assessment completed and a plan in place.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions. We have time, so I'm going to see if I can get through just a couple more,
Mhm.
and then we'll probably end just a little bit early. So another question is, how should manufacturers document change decisions?
Right. Yeah, this is a good one. Like I've been talking about, documentation is key and it's going to tell the life of the story, right? So we want our manufacturers to maintain like a regulatory change assessment file. It's really any type of form that they have in their process that's going to kind of give us that description of the change. It's going to look at risk and clinical assessments. We're going to look at the regulatory classification for each market that we're selling in. And we got to write down the justification for the submission, if there's any action that we have to take, and then supply that supportive evidence, that test, the validation data. So it's having like kind of like a master file of telling the story of what we're changing.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's do two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So what are the risks if changes are not reported correctly? I know you had kind of gone over this, but how about relisting those and letting us know that again, because somebody wanted a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, as we talked about, what we saw, what's happening in the industry, right? That could result in having warning letters from the FDA. It could result in the EU suspending the CE markings. We could have product recalls. We can have import bans, loss of market access. Company reputation can be harmed. There's just numerous things that can happen if the changes are not assessed and reported correctly.
Okay, and then
Absolutely. And I'll just add to that, ultimately the greatest risk is to patients. If
Absolutely.
if you have a product that is critical for patients to be treated and all of a sudden you're unable to market that given product that that physicians are used to using for treatment, because you have failed to document your changes properly and justify not refiling. Ultimately, patients are at risk. So just
Yeah, that sounds like a big risk for sure. All right, one last question. Let's go with this final one. So can regulators retroactively request a new submission after implementation?
Absolutely. And I've actually had a client when I was consulting, had this exact thing happened. They had made a change on a product and they had documented through a change control why they felt it was submission was not needed. And this was in the US. And the auditors came in, they happened to pick that change control for review during the audit process. And they went through the decision chart, flow chart themselves and said, you know what, we disagree with you. The change that you made, we believe could impact safety or effectiveness, and you should have filed a 510(k) reporting this modification to FDA for prior approval. Luckily, in that particular scenario, they did not receive a warning letter. It was a 483 finding during the audit, and they did allow the manufacturer to go ahead and submit a 510(k) without withdrawing the product from the market. But it could easily go the other way, where they could tell you at that moment in time, as soon as their observation is documented and finalized, where they feel you did not act accordingly, they could immediately stop you from selling product. So.
All right, well, that's all the questions we have now. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. We're so appreciative of you spending time with us on our monthly webinar series. We will have one coming up next month, so we hope you'll be able to join us for that one. Be on the lookout for the sign up information to come out for that in the next week or so. And then Jodi and Danielle, thank you again both for making such a complex process simplified and easy to understand for everybody. You've really helped us understand how to manage changes for currently marketed medical devices. So we're so appreciative of your time and everything you've done to get ready for this and to share this with us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Jodi. Thanks, Danielle. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.